Hi guys, welcome to the video for Standard 8, which is World War One and the Great Depression. So we're going to get started. Remember, we have a test Monday, so use this to study. Alright, so to get started, remember that in this unit we are now sort of firmly in the 1900s. So the turn of the century has happened, technology has been radically changed. No longer are people really living without electricity, or they have cars now. They have telephones, radios are invented in the 1920s. So technology is going to be very different than in the previous units that we've been learning about. The first sort of major thing that happens in the 1900s is going to be World War One, and we need to know the years on this. Okay, so on the test, it's going to ask you about the years. So you need to know 1914 to 1918. You need to know that the U.S. doesn't get involved until 1917. And remember why the U.S. gets involved in World War One. Originally, we were neutral. We stayed out of it. But because of the Germans and their sort of submarine warfare, the sinking of the Lusitania, which was that British passenger ship that had Americans on board, and then the Germans sinking our sort of trade ships. We talked about that, how they kept doing that, and so that was one of the reasons why we get involved. And the other thing is something called the Zimmermann Telegram, which is where the Germans tried to get the Mexicans to attack us and to keep us busy in World War One during World War One, and then Germany had promised to give them back all of the land that had been stolen from them by the United States, things like California and Arizona, New Mexico, all that stuff. So those were the two primary reasons why the U.S. gets involved in World War One, and also you would want to know that it was because of our sort of relationship with the British and the French. We were friends with them for a period of 200 years at this point. That we were descendant from the British, so that was also important to us. We do want to know why World War One started. So remember, the World War One had four primary main causes, and the word "main" should help you. It's militarism, which is the M. Militarism is people building up their military. And so then when the fighting started, everyone had huge stockpiles of weapons, and the new weapons at the time were like tanks and planes and poison gas and new grenades and machine guns that are reliable. And so all of these new things led to this war being very, very deadly. The A stands for alliances. Remember that all of the countries in Europe had made alliances or friendships with other countries that said, if someone attacks me, you will help me, and if someone attacks you, we will help you. And this is one of the big ones, because remember, when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary gets attacked, it's the alliances that sort of drag everyone else into war, especially Germany, who sort of declares war right after the Archduke is killed. Imperialism is the I. So at this time, this is the time where people saw these big empires all over the world: the British and the French and the Germans, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, and they were all in competition for land and resources. And so this is going to be another sort of big contributing factor to World War One. They were fighting over land, and then also nationalism. And we said that nationalism is, at a sort of basic level, is a love for your country, but in the instance of World War One, it's I love my country so much that I'm going to take over other countries as well. And also, it plays into the idea of the Serbians, because remember that the Serbians were the ones who wanted their own country, they wanted their own land. And so there was nationalism that led to them sort of killing the Archduke. So nationalism sort of contributed in that way as well. You do want to know sort of the character of World War One, like what were the characteristics or what was the fighting like. World War One, we said, was like trench warfare. Remember, they were fighting in these big ditches that were miles and miles long, and they had this huge stalemate where neither side was really winning, neither side was really losing. Millions of people are getting killed. We said that in between the two sides of the trenches was this place called No Man's Land, where you saw, barbed wire and landmines and people shooting rockets across into the other people's sides. And, this was a deadly, miserable war to fight in. So the characteristics of the war are talking about sort of what was it like to fight in World War One. We have some weapons here, poison gas. We saw that in the video that we watched the other day. They said that one of the first, groups to get hit by that was a Canadian sort of troop, and it said that it scared them to death because they didn't really know what was happening. Here we've got airplanes. Obviously, the this is the first war where airplanes were more reliable. They could actually use them to fight, and so they did. But that's also becomes more prevalent in World War II than World War One. Airplanes were still pretty new. And then we've got tanks were invented by the British in World War One, and they were mostly used to get you transported across the trenches and across no man's land, across like the landmines and everything, barbed wire, all that stuff. All right, so now we're into the sides of the war, and this is going to be really important. So we need to know that there's two sides in World War One. Okay, on the one side we've got the Triple Entente, which stands for the Triple Alliance. Okay, Entente, it's French, and that would have been Great Britain, France, and Russia. Okay, now we know that in 1917 Russia is going to drop out of World War One because that's when a political party called the Bolsheviks, who are the communists, take power in Russia because Russia goes through a revolution. The people in Russia were running out of food because of the war, and they were poor and they were struggling and they were tired of the war. And so they overthrew the Tsar, a guy named Tsar Nicholas II, and they overthrow him. And the Bolshevik Party, or the Communist Party, led by a guy named Vladimir Lenin, takes over in Russia, and Russia drops out of the war. And so then the United States kind of picks up where Russia left off. And so the United States gets involved in 1917 again. We said we need to know that. And then they become the Allied powers. Central powers are Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Remember, the Ottoman Empire is like present-day Turkey, and that empire is basically dismantled after World War One. There is no more Ottoman Empire or Austria-Hungary after World War One. Germany obviously is still a country after World War One, but their empire is shrunken down, and they take a lot of their land away, which is why in World War Two, when Hitler starts taking over all of these places, a lot of it he's just claiming back a lot of the land that was taken from the Germans after World War One. Okay, so reasons for the U.S. entering into World War I. We already talked about this. Just know unrestricted submarine warfare, which is talking about the Lusitania and also merchant ships. I did talk about something in class called the Sussex Pledge, and we said that was where the United States tried to avoid the war, and we told the Germans, you have to warn our sailors before you attack our ships. And for a while they were doing that. They would come up to the top of the water. They would promise, hey, we won't, we're not going to kill you. We're going to sink the ship, or we're going to take all of the stuff on the ship, but we're not going to kill the sailors. And then as the war drags on and on and on, eventually the United States says, okay, or the Germans say, okay, we're not going to do that anymore. And then they went back to just sinking every ship that they saw out on the open seas. And that, obviously didn't make the Americans happy, and is one of the things that brings us into the war. Zimmerman Telegram, that's where they try to get Mexico to attack us, and we talked about that, okay? Now, specifically, we do need to really know, what role did Georgia play in World War I? The big thing with Georgia is that we had more military training camps in Georgia where we were training soldiers to go and fight than any other state, okay? So make sure you know that. And this is still really big today. I mean, Georgia has the biggest military, like, boots on the ground training camps than any other state still today. So you need to know that. The big one today is Fort Benning. A lot of soldiers go through there for like basic training and stuff like that, right? Georgia did have 100,000 soldiers fight in World War I, so we had a lot of people volunteer to go and fight in the war. That's going to be important. And also, you need to know how civilians at home also could have supported the war effort. So remember that the United States was selling these things called war bonds, which is where you could buy a bond, which is basically like an investment, from the government, and you would say, okay, I'm going to give the government $100, and the government's going to agree to give you your money back in a certain amount of time, whether that's 5, 10, 15 years, however much time is on the bond, and then the government's going to pay you interest. So it's basically loaning the government money so that they could go and fight the war, and they're going to agree to pay you back later when they have the money back, right? Victory gardens are also very important. Victory gardens are where the American people were encouraged to grow their own food. So like, their own tomatoes or watermelons or squash, whatever it is, they have to grow their own stuff so that the stuff that the farmers are growing can be used in the war effort. So that can be given to the soldiers or the soldiers of our allies. And the American people could kind of offset that by growing some of their own things. You could still go to the grocery store, but they were trying to limit, how much you could buy. And they actually started rationing things a lot more in World War II than World War I, but they did that a little bit in World War I too. the Roaring Twenties. So remember that World War One ends on November 11th, 1918, and that's considered Veterans Day today. And you want to know that Germany surrenders, right? And so then the United States comes back, and we see ourselves as heroes. We entered into the war. Our side won. Everything's fantastic. Men are coming back from the war. They're getting married. They're buying houses. They're having children. They call this time period the Roaring Twenties, meaning it's supposed to be a time of sort of great euphoria or happiness. Everything's going great. And for a period of about 12 years after the war, it did. But then we started to see some problems happen, right? But in the Roaring Twenties itself, all the way from 1918 to 1929, things were awesome in the United States. And so a couple of interesting things happened during this time period, and you need to know these. First thing you want to know is that the 18th Amendment gets passed in the 1920s. This is the amendment that bans alcohol, and that's called Prohibition. And we said that they did this because they thought that if they banned alcohol, that would get rid of crime, and it would sort of make, we wouldn't have to put so many people in jail, and it would save us money. But it turned out that it had the opposite effect. So the 18th Amendment led to a lot of people smuggling alcohol into the United States. We saw a lot of organized crime, like the mob, start to take over in cities like New York and Chicago and Boston. And so we saw a lot of crime actually go up in the 1920s because of Prohibition. And a lot of people just kind of ignored Prohibition. They drank anyway. You would just go to places called speakeasies, which were like these illegal bars where you would have to the special knock or the code, or you have to be able to prove you weren't a cop. And then you could go into the bar and drink anyway. Commercialism is a big thing in the 1920s. So today, we are very sort of materialistic for the most part. We go to Walmart or Target or Best Buy, and we look around and we're like, I like that. I need to have that. I don't necessarily need whatever that is, but I like that and I want that. And so this idea that you're buying things because you want them and not because you need them becomes very popular in the 1920s because there's all this new cool stuff. Electricity is new, and there's all these new inventions. You're going to start to see early versions of the dishwasher, and you're going to see early versions of radios, and whether it's vacuum cleaners or whatever, refrigerators. People are going to want all of these cool new things, and they are going to buy them on credit, which we know becomes a problem in the 1930s, right? Rise of the stock market. So you're going to see Wall Street become a thing in the 1920s. Companies are going to be selling stock in their company to try to invest and make money so that they can come up with new things. And that's a good thing in the 1920s for the most part until the Great Depression happens with the stock market crash, right? Harlem Renaissance, that's a very important sort of cultural movement. That is where you started to see sort of black culture become sort of mainstream in the 1920s. So you saw people like Louis Armstrong, who was a trumpet player, or Duke Ellington, who was a jazz musician, or Langston Hughes, who was a poet. You saw a lot of white people going to Harlem, New York, to go to the same clubs as the black people. So this was the first time you saw black musicians and artists and poets and painters sort of in the mainstream. The white people knew who they were. And that's a new thing for the 1920s. And then the last thing that happens that's really big in the 1920s you need to know is the 19th Amendment is passed, which gives women the right to vote. And that's, obviously a great thing, but also a very big deal. Great Depression, though. So obviously we know that the 1930s, not so good. So we said that, the Great Depression, the official sort of start of it had been sort of leading up to that during the 20s, but the sort of official start, we could say, is October 29th, 1929, which we call Black Tuesday, which is the day the stock market crashed. Now remember, the stock market crash was not the only cause of the Great Depression. There were a lot of problems that made the stock market crash happen, and also that made the Depression last longer, okay? So here's sort of the main problem that was going on. At the time, when Americans became very sort of consumerist or sort of materialistic, they were buying a lot of stuff. So during World War I, there were tons of new factories built and tons of new factory jobs that were created in order to make things for the war effort. Well, when the war was over and the men came home, the factory owners didn't want to give up the money they were making in the war, and they didn't want to have to lay people off. And so what they did is they shifted from making wartime goods, planes and tanks and stuff, to making consumer goods, radios and clothes and, tools or whatever it was they were making. And they hoped that the American people could just keep buying enough stuff to keep those factories going so that the factory owners are still making money, the people get to keep their jobs, and eventually the whole system kind of dies because there's too many goods being made, which is overproduction, and there wasn't enough people to buy them, which is underconsumption. So the factories are making all of this stuff, and they're like, well, maybe we can sell it to Europe, or maybe we can sell it to Asia, or maybe we can sell it to someone else. But the problem is that because of World War I, nobody else had the money to buy our goods. And so once production becomes too much, they can't, sell anything, the factory owners start laying off workers and shutting down, which causes really high unemployment. And the problem is that a lot of the American people who were buying these things on credit, what happens is they can no longer make their credit payments because they had, bought a car or a radio, they had bought a house, or they had bought a refrigerator or whatever, and they bought it on credit. Well, when they lost their job, they couldn't make the payments on those things anymore. And the stores started taking things back, or whoever you bought it from started taking things back. But then they couldn't sell those used goods at a price high enough to make money off of those goods. And then all of a sudden the stores or the banks or whoever started closing as well. Okay, so that was another major problem. So we had unemployment, we had overproduction and underconsumption, we had credit that wasn't getting paid off. All of this is going to be a problem, right? And then you also had the stock market. So the stock market was a new thing in the 1920s, and people didn't really understand how it works, and most people don't have a good understanding of it now. Like I said, I know the sort of basic structure of how it works, but if I knew how to make money on the stock market, I would be doing that right now, So the way the stock market works is companies will sell little pieces of their company for a certain amount of money. Let's say one stock in a company is $100. Well, you buy that, and now you technically own a little bit of that company. And the company takes that stock and they invest it into themselves, and that money that they got from the stock, and they make a new product. Maybe they make a new cell phone, or they make a new car with it. And you hope as the stock owner that they're going to sell a lot of those cars or cell phones, and then the value of the stock you bought will go up. You can sell the stock and make money on it. But there was nobody checking the companies to make sure that they were being truthful about the products they were selling. So car companies or whatever might not have been saying the truth about how much that stock was actually worth. So they were selling you a stock for $500 that maybe only was worth $100. And then when people started getting nervous about the stock market and they started pulling their money out, the value of all those stocks came crashing down. And this causes multiple problems because companies are going to start closing, which leads to unemployment. Banks are going to be forced to close because a lot of banks had been loaning out money to people who were putting it in the stock market, and the banks did not get their money back because the banks were not making sure that people had collateral or something of value that they could collect if the stock market lost their money. And so a lot of banks had been loaning out money with sort of bad loans to untrustworthy people. And when the stock market crashed, the banks had to start closing too. And so it was kind of like a perfect storm of everything going wrong at the same time. High unemployment, 25% unemployment, 1 in 4 could not find a job. We had bank closures, we had overproduction, underconsumption, we had credit issues. Everything's going wrong at the same time. And then all of a sudden, this happens and it gets even worse. The Dust Bowl. Remember that this was out in the Midwest, out in Texas and Nebraska and sort of those areas, New Mexico. And basically, there was a drought. The farmers, they were not, sort of conserving the soil right. And then because of the drought, the soil is even more dry. It's turning sandy. And then they have windstorms, which starts blowing all the topsoil away, which causes these huge dust storms pretty much all over the United States because of this. And it ruins the farms, and the farmers can't grow food, they can't make money, and so the farmers start losing their homes and their farms, and they're also now going to look for work in the cities. A lot of them went out to California looking for farming jobs, but there's not jobs out there, so that makes the unemployment even worse. So it's just yet another thing that's dragging the economy down, and this is going to be a huge, huge problem, okay? Georgia, we were not exempt from all of this. The stock market affected us. Agricultural problems affected us. They were a little bit different than the droughts. We did have droughts here, but the big problem in Georgia, besides the droughts, is that we also had this problem called the boll weevil, which was this beetle that would, destroy the cotton crops. And so between a drought and now this bug that's killing all the cotton, the farmers in Georgia could not make a living either. They lost their farms, they lost their homes, they would move into Atlanta or other cities looking for work, but there wasn't work for them, okay? Now, the problem at the time, though, is that the president was a guy named Herbert Hoover when the stock market crashed and everything started. And Herbert Hoover got the blame for the Great Depression, which is not really fair. It's not his fault that the banks loaned out money to people they couldn't pay it back. It's not his fault that the stock market crashed. It's not his fault that the factories were making too much stuff and had to lay people off. None of that is his fault. But the reason why he gets the blame is, number one, he's the president. And if things are going bad in the country, especially the economy, then the president usually gets the blame for it. But number two, it was sort of his beliefs that were not appropriate for this time in history. So if, for instance, he was the president right now, people would probably like Herbert Hoover, because Herbert Hoover would get up in front of the American people and he would say, rugged individualism, this belief that you are in control of your own destiny, that it's not the job of the government to take care of you, that you should get a job, you should support your family and support yourself, and if you can't do that, then, it's up to private organizations, charities, businesses who could employ people, churches to come in and help people. And all of that sounds sort of like what most people in America believe today, except today in America, we also have this sort of government safety net. We have programs where if somebody's homeless, the government will help them get a home for a period of time. Or if they don't have food, the government will help them get a food for a period of time. There was no sort of safety net when Herbert Hoover was president. And so when Herbert Hoover says it's not the job of the government to take care of you, the government was literally not doing anything for these people who are struggling. And in American history before this, that might have been okay because unemployment was sort of under control, the economy was usually good, but when 1 in 4 working adults cannot make a living, it's not possible for them to take care of themselves, and the churches could not step in and take care of millions of people. And the private businesses who are closing down can't do anything about it. They can't pay people more money or hire more people, and so they're not able to help. And so a lot of people are like, Herbert Hoover, you just don't get it. And it didn't help that Hoover was sort of like a self-made man. He worked his way up and became a millionaire, and he was like, well, why can't everyone else do this? And in previous times in history, other people might have been able to do that, but it's the Great Depression, and there's 25% unemployment, and the stock market's crashed, and there's droughts, and everything's going wrong at the same time. And Herbert Hoover did not understand what role he should have played to help these people. And so that is a very, very big deal. So we said that when Hoover becomes president and things start going bad, people start giving him the blame. And we talked about all of these things that they started naming after him. The Hoover flags where people were pulling their pockets out. The Hoover blankets, which were these newspapers. And then we had over here the Hoovervilles, which were like these shanty towns or slums that people were, who had been thrown out of their homes would go into the middle of cities or right outside of cities and build these shacks that they called these Hoover hotels. And they would live there because they had nowhere else to go. There was nobody there to help them. So Hoover really his name became mud after the Depression started because he wasn't sort of acknowledging the fact that maybe the government should do something about it. And plus, they didn't understand that the Depression was going to last as long as it did. They thought that this was, the economy goes up and it goes down all the time. Even today, if you watch the news, some days the stock market goes up 300 points and the next day it goes down 600 and then it goes up 900. It's a cycle. But they didn't understand how different this sort of downturn was. They thought it could last a couple of months. It might last a year at the most. But then this thing drags on for his whole presidency and he doesn't do anything about it. This right here was also a very important story when it came to Hoover. It's called the Bonus Army. You want to know that this is where a bunch of soldiers who were promised a bonus, money, after World War I were told that they would get this thing in the 1940s. But they were like, hey, unemployment's really bad. We need our money now. So they go to the White House and they try to get Hoover to pay them out. It's called the Bonus Army. So this is not the U.S. Army. This is just a bunch of ex-soldiers who called themselves this. And they were like, pay us early. And Hoover wouldn't give them the money early. The government might not even have the money early. But he basically, these men built a Hooverville right outside of the White House, or almost across the street in the Capitol, and they were marching and protesting, and they weren't violent, but they, were right across the street basically. And Hoover had the National Guard go in and try to break up the bonus army, tell these men that they had to go home, that they couldn't be out there protesting. And these men had brought everything that they had left with them, all of the clothes they had, all of the tools they had, whatever they had, their families were with them. And when Hoover sent the National Guard over there, they burnt down these men's Hooverville or their shacks or whatever, and it destroyed all of their possessions. And on top of that, 2 of these men were killed. And so to the American people, this was horrible. He just treated American soldiers terribly. And so this was sort of like a couple of months before the election. So the American people were already mad at him, and now they're really mad at him. So no more Herbert Hoover after 1932. 1932, we had the election of FDR. You want to know that FDR comes into office and he says, you know what? The relationship that you have with your government has to change. Because of the situation we're in, the government can no longer sit by and let people struggle through this depression. And that was a brand new idea, because before this, the government was pretty hands-off with the economy. And now FDR is like, I'm going to take control of the economy. I'm going to start to try to help the banks. I'm going to try to help the stock market. I'm going to try to help businesses. We're going to try to fix this mess so that people are not homeless and starving anymore. And he gets up and he says, American people, I need your trust. I need a little bit of time. And he says, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. We will work through this together. And so FDR was loved by the American people. He's the only president to ever serve more than 2 terms. Now, it's impossible. There's a constitutional amendment to stop this from happening. But FDR was elected for 4 terms. He serves 3 because he dies early into his 4th term. But the American people loved him. And what you want to know is that when he takes office, he says, okay, I'm going to offer the people a New Deal, okay? And the New Deal is all about creating programs to make the Depression better, okay? And that's what you need to know. Now, a lot of people are going to say that the New Deal is where the government starts to gather more power. And that's true, because as he's creating all of these programs, he's giving the government more responsibilities. Now the government's going to take care of the elderly. Now the government's going to raise taxes. Now the government's going to create jobs and build infrastructure without private companies. And all of this stuff that he's going to do. The government's going to build dams for electricity in the rural areas. And all of this stuff that the government's going to do means that the government is seizing more parts of the economy, taking more power for itself, and that starts to make some people nervous, because in America we believe, private businesses are over here, government's over here, and so that's capitalism. And so this, to some people, sounded a lot like socialism. It's the government's going to take care of people, and that's not really a thing that we do, by and large. So that was scary to the American people. But again, we're in the middle of a Great Depression. People were literally starving and homeless, and there was nothing they could do about it. And so FDR says, I'm going to offer you a New Deal. We're going to fix this, right? Now, the New Deal had 3 main sort of goals: relief, recovery, reform. Relief is immediate help. You're going to get food, you're going to get shelter, we're going to get the American people stabilized so that they're not starving and miserable anymore. The next sort of part of his plan was recovery. I'm going to create jobs. And the big thing with this is that the government didn't have a lot of money at the time. So he's going to basically increase government spending. We called this deficit spending. That's a big deal. Where he's going to get the American government into debt in order to create jobs for the American people. And now he's not just giving them money. He's having them do things like build infrastructure, new roads, bridges. He's going to have them build schools and airports. He's going to have them build courthouses. He's going to have them build jails, all of this stuff that he knows is going to increase productivity in America and make us more money in the long run. So that was a smart thing. He didn't just start handing people money and saying, okay, because he also knew that there was a psychological aspect to the Great Depression. It was people who were out of work and felt hopeless, and he gave them a purpose. And that is a very sort of important part of FDR, is he made people feel like they could survive again, that they had a purpose, that they had a goal, and that's a huge thing for a president to do. He gave people hope. And the last part of this is reform. You want to know that with reform, it's him passing laws so that another depression, while not impossible, maybe couldn't happen again as easily. So he started passing laws for things like banks, saying that banks had to be able to prove that when they loaned out money to people, you know, you're sure that there's a reasonable expectation that those people are going to pay you back. Or in the stock market, they're going to start auditing companies to make sure that they're actually worth as much as they say they are, so that they can't drive stock prices up, and they're going to regulate the stock market. They're going to create laws where if a bank closes, you don't just lose all your money. The government's going to step in and help you get your money back and things like that. So a lot of things to try to prevent another Great Depression. Now, FDR creates a ton of programs. If you look over here on the right, the Emergency Banking Act, Federal Emergency Relief Act, we talked about the CCC, and we talked about all of these things. All of these programs made life for the American people better, but they did not fix the Depression. They cost the American government millions of dollars, right? So how did the Depression end? When World War II breaks out and the United States starts selling weapons to our allies at first, and then we get into the war ourselves, that's what gets us out of the Great Depression, because all of our factories are booming again, making all of these wartime goods, and they're making tons of money, off the charts making money again. And that's what fixes the Depression. But FDR made the Depression sort of livable for a little while. And if the war had not broken out, hopefully something else would have happened where they would have figured out how to make a lot of money, but maybe not. Maybe he would have made things better for a little while, and then things could have gotten worse later. We don't know. Obviously, that didn't happen. We do need to know about some of these New Deal programs, though. We need to know about the CCC. We need to know that that's the Civilian Conservation Corps. We need to know that that's the one that gave young unmarried men jobs. And we need to know that that was used where the men would be given a certain amount of money. I think it was like $7 or $8. And then they would get to keep some of that money, and then they would send the rest of it to their families. So it also supported the people back home. The REA, or the Rural Electrification Administration, you might have heard this one linked up with something called the Tennessee Valley Authority before in previous classes, but basically this is where they were building hydroelectric dams to electrify the South. Places like North Georgia or really southern Tennessee or Alabama or Mississippi, they didn't have electricity in a lot of these places, so they started building dams so that they could generate electricity and run wires out to people's homes, because people started having electricity in their houses right around the turn of the century, and we're now in the 1920s, and people don't have 1930s, and people don't have electricity, so that was a big deal to people. Next thing we have is the AAA, or the Agricultural Adjustment Act. You do want to know what that does. That's the one where he was paying farmers not to grow crops on parts of their lands because if they did that, it would lower the supply of the crops and raise the price of the crops. Now, the American people were mad about this because it raised the price of food. But at the same time, if the farmers can't make a living off of growing food, then they're not going to be able to afford their farms or pay their debts, and they're not going to be able to keep growing food. And so that could have led to a food shortage. So it was like trying to solve one problem but causing another problem. But if you don't solve this problem, it's going to be worse if the farmers can't make a living. So, this was a hard one. The last one I have is the Social Security Administration. You have to know that. That is the one that helps the elderly, people 65 and over. It helps the disabled, and it helps widows, people who have children and their husband or wife have died. And basically that program is an additional tax that the American people have to pay. And then they support the people that are on Social Security now. And then when you are 65 and older, or you become disabled, then the people who are paying into the program are paying for you. Okay. All right. FDR in Georgia. We do need to know that FDR had polio, which is like a virus that made it to where he couldn't walk. And you want to know that because of this, FDR used to travel a lot to a place called Warm Springs, Georgia, where he would soak in these like sort of natural hot springs. And FDR had actually built a house that today people call the Little White House in Georgia. And so even when he was president, he would come to Georgia a lot because with the polio, he was in a lot of pain in his muscles and joints and stuff. And so he would soak in here. He said it would make him feel better, and then he would go back to Washington and do what he had to do. But when he was in Georgia, his time at the Little White House and at the hot springs, he would interact with the people of Georgia a lot. And, FDR was a rich guy from New York. He might not have had a lot of sort of experience talking to farmers and people from rural areas in the South if he had not came here so much. And so when he becomes president and he knows about Georgia and he knows about the plight of the farmers and, the people who are struggling, he's, a lot of his New Deal programs were created to help people in those situations. And so, like the Agricultural Adjustment Act might not have gotten passed if FDR didn't really understand the problems of people in places like Georgia. So this really opened up his eyes and made him able to understand the people of the rural South. This guy you got to talk about, or you need to know about. Eugene Talmadge was a governor of Georgia in the 1930s, and his sort of claim to fame is that he would put himself out there as an opposition to the New Deal. He did not like it. He did not like FDR. He thought, really, he didn't like FDR for two reasons, okay? Reason number one is that he did not like the fact that with the New Deal, he thought that the government was sort of taking too much power away from private citizens, or taking business opportunities away from private citizens. Because if the government's creating all of these jobs, well, that's going to hurt the private companies that used to do those jobs. So if FDR is, having people building roads or having people building schools or whatever, then it's going to hurt the businesses that used to do those things. Or, and FDR had way more types of careers than just that. He had been hiring artists to go out and paint murals on buildings and stuff, just so that they would have a job, right? But we're also accomplishing something. So Eugene Talmadge felt like the government was interfering too much in the economy and seizing too much power for itself. And then the second reason Talmadge didn't like the New Deal is very wrong. He was definitely a white supremacist, and so he thought that it was wrong that if a black man and a white man were both working for like the CCC, which was the Civilian Conservation Corps, the young guys are working, or if they were working for the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, which was like the CCC but for the older people. If a white guy and a black guy were working for one of those organizations, the white guy and the black guy would both make the same amount of money. And Eugene Talmadge thought that the black guy should make less money. So he didn't like it because he saw the New Deal as being too equal, I guess. And so he did not like that at all. Talmadge serves one term as a Georgia governor. Then he tries to get elected to the senator a few times, and then that's it. But that's the end of these notes. Good luck, study. If you have questions, shoot me a message on Edmodo. I'll be glad to answer.